Speak to Antony Loewenstein, who's an independent journalist, also author of My Israel Question. Antony was based in occupied East Jerusalem between 2016 and 2020. Hello, Antony. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi,
We've reported in the past few days about Sudan's RSF paramilitary entering a village and killing 100 people. Over the years, we've reported on how Myanmar's military is cracking down there and killing hundreds of people. How is this any different?
Because Palestinian lives don't matter. Not to you and me, not to your viewers, but to Western powers, to Israel. And you see that how in the Israeli media, with some exceptions, the vast majority of coverage in the last 24 hours has been celebratory. Now, on the one hand, understandable, yes, obviously 4 Israeli captives are back. But Palestinian deaths, Palestinian slaughter barely gets any traction because people aren't interested within Israel. If there were 50,000 killed in the last 8 months, 100,000, 500,000, I fear that there'd be no number, not just within Israel, I might add, but in many parts of the Jewish diaspora. Not all. There are growing parts of the Jewish community globally, myself and many others, that are critical of what Israel's doing and have been for years. But the sad reality is that the dehumanization of Palestinians has been so complete, supported by pretty much the entire Western political elite and many in the media too. So just finally, what it says, I think, is yes, Israel has pretty much carte blanche. What it does not have and what it has not achieved in the last 8 months is any sense of victory, to put it bluntly. But frankly, more seriously for Israel moving forward, its image in many parts of the world is broken, utterly broken. That's based on public opinion polls, various other metrics. So Israel's got a problem on its hands, to put it mildly, moving forward.
This issue of Israel's position globally once this conflict comes to an end. We've got the ICJ, which could take years to decide whether this was genocide that Israel is conducting in Gaza. We've got the ICC seeking an arrest warrant for the defense minister of Israel and the prime minister. We've got just 24 hours ago, the UN is about to add Israel to a blacklist of country that harms children during conflict. But won't all of that become immaterial if Saudi Arabia eventually signs the paperwork which will lead to it recognizing Israel officially, and that would change the dynamic in the Middle East? That might be the plan. The Americans might be saying to the Israelis, do what you have to do, because the Saudis are going to save the situation whenever that happens.
Look, certainly in the Middle East, the equation would change if the Saudis sign a normalization deal. But I have to say, the normalization deal that Israel signed with various other Arab states in the last years, mostly when Trump was president, they're a house of cards. They're an utter house of cards. Yes, the states are closer. There was an arms deal, essentially, that all those Arab states were desperate for Israeli repressive technology, surveillance tech to repress their own people. And the US, of course, was interested in forming that relationship. So even if Saudi signs a deal with Israel, bottom line, it won't help Palestinians overnight, but that's not going to have any impact, in my view, about how many parts of the world continue to campaign, boycott, and target Israel. And you already see many signs, not just in the global south, but other parts of the world, talking about arms embargoes. Now, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be led by the US or the UK or much of Europe. But some parts of Europe are pushing for that. And it's interesting that in the caveat, of course, is that in the parts of the world where the right and the far right are growing in strength, particularly in Europe and parts of the US, what Israel's been doing in the last 8 months, in fact, is strengthen that support. They support that kind of mass slaughter of Palestinians because they don't regard Palestinians as human beings, and they very much fit into the whole notion of Israel's so-called war on terror. But I think vast other parts of the world, the global south, much of the global left, they won't forget. Now, how that manifests itself will be depending on country by country. But I think that Israel is well aware of the fact that its image has been tarnished, to put it mildly, hugely aware of that, which is why we just saw last week examples of an Israeli-led disinformation campaign trying to shift public opinion in the US, which failed miserably, by the way. That will continue and increase in the coming years. I have no doubt about that.
In terms of the longer term and some kind of permanent solution to the issues between Israel and Palestine, what's the most important moment? What's happening right now, or what happens the day after the next election in Israel? In other words, how are the Israelis, the citizens, going to affect their country's relationship with Palestine?
Look, I'm relatively pessimistic about the Israeli public changing too much. Netanyahu won't be prime minister forever, of course, but the likely successors, Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, are pretty similar, frankly, on these questions. Gaza, the occupation, not much difference. I don't really see change coming much from within Israel. I see it coming from the outside, and that's not just based on my own opinion, but a lot of Israeli friends of mine and Palestinian friends of mine are aware that there's just not the constituency within Israel. And it's worth saying that many of the Israeli Jewish youth are becoming much more right-wing long before October 7. The studies have sadly shown that. Much more intolerant, much more racist towards Palestinians than even their parents or grandparents, if that's possible to imagine. This is going to come from outside pressure, outside sanctions, and outside a sense that economically, until Israelis and Israel feels economic pain, for example, settlers can't travel to Europe. Settlers can't do deals with banks in Europe or the US. Now, the US and the EU has started in a very, very slow way some kind of small sanctions on the most radical Jewish settlers. That needs to massively expand to go after the Israeli government that's backing them. I mean, to go after a handful of settlers is fine, but there's an Israeli state that supports the settler movement, particularly in the West Bank and around East Jerusalem. So I don't have a lot of faith in the Israeli public itself. Of course, there are Israelis that are doing wonderfully important work, but they're a tiny minority. This has to come from the outside, not dissimilar to South Africa decades ago, where change really mostly came, of course, from the ANC black majority, but from outside global pressure.
Yep, absolutely. Antony Loewenstein, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for the analysis.
Thank you. Thank you.